Hi everyone! In this video, we're going to talk about JavaScript modules. We'll see what modules are, why we use them, how export and import work, the different types of export and import, the different writing styles, and a simple way to understand when to use each one. So first, what is a module? Basically, a module is just a separate JavaScript file that can be connected with other JavaScript files. In other words, modules help us split code into smaller logical parts. Instead of putting everything in one huge file, we break code into multiple files and connect them when needed. A file becomes a module when we use import or export inside it. And by that, I literally mean that the keyword import or export is written inside that JavaScript file. We'll get into the details in a moment, but for now, that basic picture is enough. To understand why modules are used at all, let's imagine a JavaScript application where all logic and all data are placed in one single file. That file could have thousands of lines of code, hundreds of functions to manage, and hundreds of variables that all need different names because they all exist in the same scope. Think about how difficult it would be to build and maintain an application like that. This is where modules help. They let us separate logical parts into different files, and we can give each file a name that matches the part of the logic it contains. That way, it becomes much easier to find the part of the code we need. So, we use modules so that we don't keep all our code in one file, but instead split it into multiple files that work together. This is especially useful in React because we often place components in separate files and then use them in other parts of the application. For example, that file can contain several variables, and each of them holds some value. When we need one of those values somewhere in our code, we can take that value from that file and use it in another file where we need it. So, in order to use a value from one file in another, we need to define those files as modules. In other words, we somehow need to tell JavaScript that we want to use those files in a modular way. We do that with the keywords export and import. In the file we want to take something from, we write export, and in the file where we want to bring something in, we write import. Now we come to the slightly more complicated part. There are multiple ways of using export and import, and besides that, there are also different writing styles. First, we'll go through some actual ways of using them, meaning different functionalities. These are named export import and default export import. Let's start with the first type, named export import. It has two parts, export and import. We'll first look at named export. Here are a couple of basic examples to help us understand the idea more easily. They are not the only way to write it, and we'll look at other styles later as well. In this case, we use the keyword export with the variable we want to export. First, we declare the variable and assign a value to it, and then we export that variable. While doing that, we use curly braces. In one module, we can have multiple variables that we want to export in this way. We can export them one by one, but we can also export several of them at once. Now, let's see how named import works. Here, we use the keyword import, the name of the value, the keyword from, and the file path. Again, notice the curly braces. And one very important rule here. With named import, we use the same name that was used during export. So, if the exported value is called myObject, we also import it under the name myObject. And just like with export, we can also import multiple values at once. There is also one useful option here. Even though named import normally uses the same name, we can rename the imported value by using the keyword as. So here, we imported myObject, but immediately gave it a new local name. From that point on, inside that file, we use the new name. Let's move to the second type, default export import. Here we have two parts as well. Let's first look at default export. We still use export, but this time we also add the keyword default, and here we don't use curly braces. These are two visual differences between named and default export. Let's see the matching import. Again, no curly braces. And here is another important difference. With default import, the name does not have to match the original variable name. Why? Because a module can have only one default export. So whatever name we use here, it will refer to that one default export. Of course, in real code, we usually use the same name or a very similar one for clarity. So let's quickly compare these two types. Named export import uses curly braces, can export multiple named values, and the imported name normally matches the exported name. Default export import does not use curly braces, exports one main value, and the imported name can be different. Besides different types of export import, we also have two different writing styles, but they apply only to export. These are separate style and inline style. With the separate style, we first declare the variable and export it later. With the inline style, we write the export together with the declaration. The choice of export import type, whether named or default, and the choice of export writing styles, whether inline or separate, depend on what we are exporting and how we want to write the code. To make this easier to understand and remember, we can use ideas of declaration and expression as a guide. And I want to point out that these are not strict rules, but more like patterns that appear quite often. So, if we use inline export, we can remember this pattern. Declaration usually goes with named export import, and expression usually goes with default export import. This is helpful because it gives us a simple starting point when we are not sure which option to use. But if we use that pattern, there is one important exception for modern React: a function created with a function declaration. That kind of function can be exported both as named and as default. When we use separate export, that declaration versus expression way of thinking is no longer as important. That's because we first store the value in the variable and only then decide how to export it. So in this case, we can choose either named or default export. And that's it for export import types and export styles. But before we finish, let's briefly mention one thing about imported values. An imported value cannot be reassigned directly. That means that if we try to assign a new value to an imported variable, we'll get an error. In other words, an imported value is read-only. Alright, let's quickly wrap it up. Modules help us organize code into multiple files that work together. We talked about two export-import types, named and default, and we also talked about two export styles, inline and separate. Named export is used when we want to export multiple named values, while default export is used when we want to export one main value from a module. And for inline export, this can be a helpful guideline. Declarations go with named export, while expressions go with default export. Again, this is not a strict rule, just a useful way to think about it. And finally, remember that imported values are read-only. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.